Quietism is a philosophical stance that denies the possibility of making progress on certain kinds of metaphysical questions. In other words, it contends that many philosophical questions are either ill-posed or unanswerable. In this video, we will start with an overview of Quietism, how it got started, the arguments supporting and opposing it, and close with some final thoughts. Let's begin with a look at how Quietism is typically defined. Basically, it entails avoidance of substantive philosophical theorizing that can lead to confusion and linguistic errors. Some Quietists are skeptical about the possibility of making progress on any metaphysical questions, while others are more selective in their skepticism. Some Quietists deny that there are any objective truths about metaphysical matters, while others believe that there are objective truths but that we are unable to know them. One common form of Quietism is the view that metaphysical questions are ill-posed. This means that the questions themselves are based on mistaken assumptions or confusions. This also implies that they are not formulated in a clear and concise way, as well as that there is no clear consensus on what they actually mean. For example, the problem of free will and determinism is ill-posed because it is unclear what we actually mean by free will and determinism. Another common form of Quietism is the view that metaphysical questions are unanswerable in principle, difficult or impossible to solve, even if they are well posed. This means that we lack the cognitive resources to answer these questions in a meaningful way. For example, a Quietist might argue that the question of whether God exists is unanswerable in principle because we cannot know things that are beyond the limits of our experience. Or, that the mind-body problem can't be adequately answered because it is unclear how to reconcile the existence of a physical body with the existence of a non-physical mind. So, if a lot of philosophy is BS in their view, what exactly is the role of philosophy according to Quietists? Many Quietists typically argue that philosophy has a therapeutic or remedial role. This means that philosophy can help us to identify and resolve linguistic and conceptual confusions. For example, philosophy can help us to clarify the meaning of words and concepts, and to identify and resolve contradictions in our thinking. Some Quietists also argue that philosophy can be a valuable form of intellectual discipline. It can help us to think more critically and carefully about the world around us. However, Quietists emphasize that philosophy should not be seen as a way to gain knowledge about the world in the same way that science does. Although it is sometimes compared to skepticism, it is important to note that these two views are not the same thing. Skeptics deny that we can know anything for sure, while Quietists simply deny that we can make progress on certain kinds of questions. Quietism is also sometimes associated with pragmatism. Pragmatists believe that the best way to evaluate a philosophical theory is to consider its practical consequences. Quietists might argue that the best way to deal with metaphysical problems is to focus on questions that have a practical bearing on our lives. Perhaps the closest philosophical position to Quietism is minimalism. Both emphasize the importance of simplicity and contentment, although Quietism is more focused on keeping philosophy focused on simple and well-defined problems, where minimalists believe in focusing on a simplified and contented life in a more general sense. Now, let's move on to our discussion of how this philosophical stance got started. The philosophy of Quietism is often associated with the work of Ludwig Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein argued that many philosophical problems arise from misunderstandings about the nature of language. He believed that the best way to solve these problems was to engage in a kind of philosophical therapy, which would help us to clarify our concepts and avoid linguistic traps. Some commentators have argued that Wittgenstein's later work was Quietist in nature. They point to his emphasis on the limits of language and his rejection of traditional philosophical methods. However, others have argued that Wittgenstein's philosophy was not Quietist, but rather that he was offering a new way of doing philosophy. There has been renewed interest in Quietism in recent years. This is due in part to the work of philosophers such as Stanley Cavell, John McDowell, and Gideon Rozin. While these modern-day philosophers don't fully embrace all the ideas of Quietism, they do build upon Wittgenstein's perspectives. For example, they see it as philosophical therapy, designed to help people to overcome linguistic and conceptual confusions. There are a number of arguments that have been offered in favor of Quietism. One common argument is that philosophical problems are often caused by confusions in the way that we use language. Quietists argue that the best way to deal with these problems is to clarify our language rather than to try to answer them directly. They also assert that language is too limited to express metaphysical truths since it is grounded in our experiences, not a metaphysical reality. Another common argument for Quietism is that metaphysical questions are often too difficult to answer. This, they feel, leads to confusing and unsatisfactory conclusions. Quietists argue that we should focus on questions that we have a better chance of answering, such as questions about our own minds and experiences. Along the same lines, Quietists argue that there is no way to overcome the problem of skepticism since we can never be certain that our beliefs about the world are true. Some assert that philosophy is too limited in its scope to provide substantive knowledge about the world. As a conceptual discipline, it should be limited to the study of concepts and their relationships. In their view, other disciplines, such as science and art, are better equipped to provide knowledge about the world and ourselves. Some Quietists argue that Quietism has a pragmatic value since it can help us to avoid pointless disputes and to focus on more important things in life. Some take it a step further and have concerns that philosophy can actually be harmful. They contend that philosophical theorizing can lead to confusion and doubt. At its worst, it can lead to violence and oppression. For example, they will point out that some people have used their political philosophical arguments to justify oppression and wars. Now, let's consider the opinions of those who are opposed to this idea. One common criticism is that Quietism is too defeatist. Critics argue that Quietists are simply giving up on the possibility of making progress on important philosophical questions. After all, if philosophy cannot provide substantive knowledge about the world, then it is a waste of time. In a similar way, critics also point out that it is too pessimistic about the ability of philosophy to solve problems. They assert that this stance underestimates the power and benefits of philosophical reasoning. They also argue that Quietists ignore the many successes that philosophy has had in solving problems. Some think that Quietism is incompatible with the human desire for knowledge and understanding. Humans are naturally curious creatures, and we have a strong desire to understand the world around us. Quietism denies this natural desire, and it encourages us to be content with ignorance. Some critics are concerned that Quietism can have negative consequences in the real world. For example, they feel that Quietism can lead to political apathy and inaction in the face of real-world politics. Critics also argue that if Quietism is true, then we should not even be bothering to discuss it. After all, if there is no such thing as philosophical progress, then there is no reason in doing philosophy in the first place. And, if that's the case, there is no point in trying to convince anyone of the truth of Quietism. Now, for some final thoughts. First, we do need to understand that Quietism is not a simple rejection of all philosophical theorizing. Rather, it is a view that holds that philosophical theorizing should be limited in its scope and that we should be cautious about making claims about metaphysical and epistemological matters. Next, Quietism shows the value in sticking with more down-to-earth propositions due to limitations in language. I've encountered this myself while writing scripts for this channel. Some philosophical concepts can be quite difficult to express clearly. Lastly, this stance can help us to avoid too much focus on complex and abstract philosophical theories. We might find more philosophical value in exploring our immediate experiences, such as eating a meal, listening to music, or taking a walk in nature. What do you think? Is Quietism a good alternative to philosophical theorizing about complex subjects, or just a way of avoiding thinking about these concepts? Could you get away with handing in a Quietist paper that consisted of only blank pages to a professor? Thanks for watching. Please give me a like if you enjoyed this video and please comment to let me know your thoughts on it. Also, check out our other videos about other philosophical topics.